Welcome everyone to our graduate school decisions panel. We are so eager to share all of these amazing alumni stories and all of the insight that they have gathered in their own journeys. This panel is co-hosted by the Alumni Relations Office, the Career Services Office, the Office of Personal and Professional Development, and the Alumni Association Board, specifically the Student and Recent Alumni Liaison. And we are very, very excited to share these amazing pieces of advice and just to open up the forum for you to share the questions that you may have about transitioning into graduate school, and also to illuminate how many different pathways you may take. These are just 5 who happen to be extraordinary volunteers for us today, and we're so grateful for them returning to us to share their thoughts and insights with you. I want to give a quick little logistics note that if you have any tech issues during the panel, please reach out with a DM to Meg Williams, who is our event tech assistant today. And if you have any questions that arise during the event while a panelist is speaking or in between sections, please feel free to use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. If a panelist is not able to share in the moment their answer to a question, we will have time at the end of the event, so don't worry. And with that, I will turn it over to our magnificent moderator, Jamie Dunn, our Director of Career Services.
Thanks, Kelsey. Hi, everyone. It's so great. I was going to say to see you. I can't see you, but it's great to have you with us. We've been really excited to plan this panel for a long time. We've been working on the plans and logistics and getting these panelists, these recent alums. So I'm really glad you're here. I'm glad to be moderating for you all tonight. A little bit of information about how the panel will run. We're going to start with introductions of the panelists, and then we're going to go into a discussion of more of theoretical discussion about how they chose their graduate programs, what they wanted out of their graduate school experience. They all have some notes and some things in mind of what they want to talk about there. We're going to take a quick break after that, and then we're going to get into what we call the nitty-gritty of applications, personal statements, all the things that you probably have questions about as you're thinking about graduate school. And so they'll share their perspectives about those things and how they kind of practically went through the steps of applying to their graduate programs. So with that, I want to jump right in and start introductions from our panelists. Amrit, if you are up on my screen first, if you'd like to start.
Sorry, I had a sticky keyboard.
It's okay.
Yeah. Hi, yeah, my name's Amrit Paul Singh. You can call me Amrit. So I graduated from Annapolis in 2015. I'm currently a PhD candidate at Cornell University in the Department of Psychology. And I've already received my master's. As you can see on the screen, when I graduated, I was sort of split between 2 different paths in physics and cognitive science. I did successfully apply to both, so I could field questions from those 2 ends of the STEM spectrum. I also have some work experience in the field as well.
Thank you, Amrit. Nicholas?
Hi, okay. I'm Nicholas Loya. Nicholas with an H. And, I'm a classmate of Amrit's, also 2015 Annapolis graduate. And, I thought I was going to go down a psychology track. Also, I actually worked in the same lab Amrit did. And I thought I was going to do that in aid of a religious life. And so I thought I was going to be a Dominican friar. So I can actually answer some questions about that sort of discernment process. But that led to me going to business school, and now I run federal sales for a U.S. Navy contracted lighting manufacturer, and that also gives me the bandwidth to help do some nonprofit consulting on the side too. So that's really exciting, and that's my story.
Great, thank you.
Hi,
Anna?
everyone. My name's Anna. I graduated from the Santa Fe campus in 2013. And as you can tell by the photo and the coat, I'm in medical school. I'm currently a third year at the University of Queensland Ochsner Clinical School of Medicine. It's a unique program. I did my first 2 preclinical years in Australia, in Brisbane. And now I'm here in New Orleans, where the Ochsner system is centered. Doing my clinical years, so working with patients in the hospital, currently on my pediatrics rotation, which is like an amazing rotation. Had no idea I wanted to be a doctor when I graduated St. John's. Had no idea what I wanted to do when I graduated St. John's. Food truck was actually rattling around in my head as an idea. But I knew that I really wanted to be a member of a community, and I wanted to have an upbuilding role in a community. And after doing some thinking about what I'm good at, and what I wanted to do, I decided on healthcare, and I actually started in EMS as an EMT. So it's a long journey, but I'm here now, and I absolutely couldn't be happier.
Thank you, Anna. Kat?
I think like just about everyone else, I graduated from St. John's not really knowing what I wanted to do at St. John's. I worked for the NASA History Office as an intern because I was interested in space history, and I worked in a psychology lab as well for child development. And I thought for a little while that that's what I wanted to do. But I realized that I've always had questions about the law and concerns and an interest in how our legal system is built and how it's used. And to steal Anna's formulation, I've also wanted to sort of upbuild my community, and this sort of felt like the best way to use my skills. I still also work for the NASA History Office part-time, so I'm in law school and I'm working as a contractor for NASA.
Thank you, Kat. And Kelsey?
Hi, I'm Kelsey Hennigan. I actually found St. John's as a graduate program. So I finished my undergrad when I was 20 and spent 7 years in Silicon Valley in tech. So went from a world of perhaps like utility to really wanting a more deliberate time and space to read and write, as simple as that sounds. So I actually am collecting an absurd number of master's degrees along the way as I was finding my excuse to leave tech. So I first found a program that's run only over summers through Middlebury. It's called Breadloaf School of English. Those on the Santa Fe campus currently might know Mr. Walpin's name. He also is an alum of that program. But since it's run only over summers, I had to figure out what to do with my school year. Found St. John's, where on the Santa Fe campus, I completed the liberal arts degree and the Eastern Classics master's degree. And this fall, I moved up to Boise, Idaho, where I am now completing my MFA in poetry. So I can speak to humanities degrees and specifically MFA and creative degrees.
Thank you, Kelsey. I think that is all the panelists. Is that right? Yes. Thank you. So we're going to jump right in now. We're going to talk a little bit, like I said, a little bit broadly, a little bit theoretically at this point, and then we'll get into some nitty gritty. But we wanted to start by kind of asking the panelists, how does what you want out of your graduate experience, how did that determine where you applied? It's one question. And what were some of those big decisions that helped you find that path that was the best fit for you? So what led you to choosing the programs you did based on what your interests were and what you wanted to get out of your graduate programs? So if Nicholas, if you want to get us started, and then we'll go from there.
Right. I think what led me to where I went, which was the Catholic University Bush School of Business, which now has a beautiful new building, was asking why I wanted to go to business school. And I knew I did not want a terribly competitive program, because in America, the more competitive you get in business school, frankly, the harder it is to stick out. And so if you find a really solid middle tier, upper middle tier university, your quality of life is going to be a lot better. Because if you can hack junior or senior year at St. John's, you can do business school. You know, it's business, right? It is intentionally not that thoughtful. You can watch all the YouTube videos about it you want, but it's a lot of busy work. And so if you're comfortable reading for long periods of time, yeah, you can do it. And what led me there was realizing that that program had a good sense of social responsibility and ethics. You know, every class, and this was remarkable, every class from accounting to quantitative analysis had a question at least once or twice a week that revolved around, okay, but how do you know you're doing the right thing? You know, how do you know you're actually treating your customers, your other stakeholders well? Not just that you're delivering on a service, but that you're actually doing this in an ethical way. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me. And so that's how I wound up there.
It's interesting you mentioned rankings, because for creative degrees and MFAs in particular, there are some rankings out there, but they've been sort of repudiated, and they were based on surveys. So they're very much not reliable. And there are certain names everyone knows, but for the most part, if you're going to all fully funded programs are held in really high esteem. And then there are a few programs that aren't fully funded. I think the shortcut is kind of like, if you have to pay to go, it's not as good a school. There are some of the New York programs do not offer full funding to all students, but are still held in really high esteem. So when I think about making your list, making your decision, and how to narrow down, there are the obvious factors that I think are going to apply to many degree types. You know, you have cohort size, cost of living in the city, and whether there is funding available, geographical restrictions or limitations based on where you want to be. For me, I was very flexible on geography, and I was only applying to fully funded programs. So something that was really important to me was getting like the nuts and bolts details about teaching. So the way you earn your stipend is by teaching. At Boise State, I teach one course. It is capped at 15 students, and its design is completely up to my discretion, which is wonderful. At some programs, you're teaching in the English department, and you're teaching like as a TA, and you're kind of just grading papers and probably catching a lot of comma splices and dangling participles. And it might not be as meaningful a way to engage. As a stand-in for rigor, coming from St. John's, I wanted a place that was serious about reading and maybe wasn't only reading contemporary work, but was also open to the integration of philosophy, theology, and great books informing my work. So I really looked to the faculty as a signal for that, and trusted that the cohort they would choose, you know, if we had some shared values, then hopefully that's what they would be finding in the other students. My final note is the acceptance rate at these programs can be sort of maddeningly slim. They're accepting, my current program is like 2 to 3 poets per year, and they have at least 1,000 applications. They're just, the acceptance rate is sort of crazy. And so people tend to apply to at least like 8 to 10 programs, but I would really encourage students to only apply to programs that they could really see themselves attending. And I think as much as possible, I tried to limit myself from having favorites among the list. Once I made my list of schools I wanted to apply to, I didn't want to like preferential have like pet programs that I was really hoping for, because I knew the odds were not necessarily in my favor to have a lot of schools to choose from. And I certainly know of a lot of people who ended up having kind of a second tier of programs in their mind and only getting into a second tier school and feeling really torn as to whether or not they should attend.
Just from the medical school perspective, it's a slightly different approach. Most people apply to probably 15, 20, sometimes even 30 programs. It can be quite competitive. It's a lot like undergrad in that you have your reach schools, you have your competitive schools, and you have your safety schools. Things that I considered, I think step one, if you want to go into healthcare, is to decide where you want to be. That's, do you want to be an MD or a DO, a physician's assistant, a nurse practitioner, specialize in psychology? Do you want to do emergency medicine? And each of those have very different tracks. I can only really speak to the MD track. So step number one was figuring out where I wanted to be. Then literally where I wanted to be, location was important to me. It's going to be 4 years of your life, and it's going to be really hard. So you need to think about being in a place that's going to have resources for you, whether that's family, whether that's the outdoors, whether it's hobbies. You need to find that balance in order to sustain it. Medicine is a marathon. It is absolutely not a sprint. So that was sort of the second consideration. And then other things were faculty size. There are rankings that can tell you about quality of life of schools. I would encourage you to look at those resources. Match rate is very important for an MD program. After 4 years, you have to apply to a residency program. So you want to make sure that you're setting yourself up for your future or your future. And then I was just asked to speak a little bit about medical school internationally. As I mentioned, I did my first 2 years abroad in Brisbane, Australia, and it wasn't intentional. The program wound up being the most supportive. I got into it. I loved the school. I wanted an opportunity to study abroad in undergrad, and I didn't get that. So this was a bucket list sort of thing for me. Again, trying to find that work-life balance. Advantages, I got to practice medicine in a socialized healthcare system, and I got to see what that's like, and I got to see the advantages of that and the patient-provider relationship that can sort of create and foster. And some of those ideals I'm trying to bring into my practice in the United States as a physician here. Disadvantages, you are considered an international medical graduate, and if anyone's interested specifically in medical school, I'm happy to talk more about that. There are a few programs that don't accept international medical graduates, it's a blanket rule. There are not many. It's definitely an unpopular and sort of antiquated opinion amongst med programs, but that is something that you have to contend with. And then I am currently doing 2 curricula, So I have to do all of the requirements for Australia and all the requirements to the United States. It's a little bit extra added on, which I think just makes me a better physician and a better provider. It's just more tools in my toolbox, but you have to consider that as well. Yeah, thank you.
I also have a quick thought on that. 2 things I want to amplify from what Anna just said, though, are location, work-life balance, as well as really when you're applying to like an MD program, or maybe Kat can talk about the JD program side of it, but or a 5-year PhD program, think long-term. It's a place or a kind of activity you're giving 5 years of your life to. Make sure you're going to enjoy those 5 years. I guess I just wanted to share that I think from the sound of it, maybe slightly different ways of thinking about it, or maybe just a different way of articulating it to myself, which were, I thought about those 5 years and I was like, what do I want to do with those 5 years in order to answer the questions that matter most to me? So, I think part of it was spending time working on my own ability to introspect and figure out what questions mattered to me. That definitely contributed to the field shift, but also thinking about the specific skill set that I wanted to build and what I thought would be the most rewarding way to build my skill set over that 5-year period. That not only influenced what schools I looked at, but more specifically what labs. I think for STEM especially, it's less important really. It's mostly not important what the school is like. It's very important what your specific department is like, and then even more what your specific lab is going to be like. I think researching people in the faculty for those departments is probably most vital for people interested in STEM fields and STEM graduate school programs. So I think keeping an idea of what's going to make those 5 years worth it to you, and then elucidating to yourself like what are the skill sets that are going to matter for you and that you want to be picking up, that's going to be the most important thing. Just wanted to share that.
For JD programs, I also want to amplify that it's going to be really hard, and you should pick a place where you feel like you will be able to fall back on something or someone. For me, I looked only at JD programs in places where I knew I had a support system. So I didn't look outside of that because I knew I wanted to be, well, right now I'm close to my family. So I know I can go over to their house for dinner if everything gets to be too much. Rankings in law school do matter for depending on what you want to do. So if you're very interested in big law, if you want to go into corporate law, going to a highly ranked law school is going to do a lot for you. However, if like me, you're interested in public interest, I would recommend going to a law school that might pay for you to go to that law school, because you're not going to make the same money that a big fancy city corporate attorney would. And it's better to have less loans than more loans. So for me, I looked for places that were focused on public interest. Temple is a very public interest heavy school. A lot of the professors work in public interest. And if anyone's worried about, I'm never going to get into a highly ranked school, that's okay. Their attorneys graduate from all sorts of schools, all the rankings, and still get to do what they want to do. They become judges, they become corporate lawyers. For those who are worried about law school, I just want to say, take a deep breath, because I know kids who apply to law school are very stressed already. But really think about where the right place is for you and what the values are of the school you're going to. And even though the rankings do have some weight, try not to let them weigh you down too much.
Yeah, to piggyback off of Kat's point there, the support system and the stress aspect, it's difficult to underemphasize that. When I think about what got me through business school, it came down to knowing why I was in business school, and it wasn't because I wanted to do business. It was because I wanted to be able to run an operation after business school as a side, not as a main career trajectory. And so the one takeaway lesson I had at the end of business school, my professors weren't that thrilled with it, but I said, yeah, what this has confirmed for me is that I don't want to be in business. And, you need to be crystal clear on that when you go in. Maybe I know people who put this up on cork boards in their bedroom, right? To say, why am I doing this thing? That way, when it's really stressful, when you've got a sinus infection in the middle of spring or something and life seems miserable, you think back on that person you were 8 months ago and you say, oh, yeah, this is why I'm doing this, right? So, but you have to search hard for that. And it might mean you delay your applying for a year or so.
Thank you, all of you. Does anyone want to say anything or touch on, the kind of, there are lots of different degrees out there, like what kind of degree you might get, or the type of program that you want to go to depending on your goals and what you want to do? Does anyone want to touch on some of that?
I can. I can speak to sort of the different law things you can do. I considered for a little bit doing a PhD and law degree at the same time. There are a couple of joint programs. That is something, if you have a really definitive question that you're interested in, that I would highly recommend you do. I think it's very cool. For me, I realized that I was very interested in learning more about the law before I made any decisions on what exactly I was going to go into. But I do know, for most people, if you're interested in the law, if you're interested in, questions about the law, questions about our Constitution, you should probably get a JD first or in conjunction with another degree. Pretty much everyone that I've read or know that does research also has their JD, and then they go get their master's degree or go get their PhD in whatever they're interested in. So just for the students that are interested in that.
I also have a thought about that, which is STEM has a plethora of different fields and specifically differently named degrees that you can get. The most traditional are, of course, going to be normal master's and PhD programs. So for more applied stuff, terminal master's programs are great. Like if you want to go become an electrical engineer, get your master's and you'll probably have a nice old career, just a great time. For some of the more experimental and theoretical stuff, there are skills that just necessarily take longer to learn. And your training period is going to be that full 5 years or longer, depending on your field. I will say it is incredibly important to think through what you want to be able to do. So again, focusing on skill sets, but also sometimes focusing on credentials. STEM degrees range everything from like, you know, PhDs in theoretical astrophysics to like joint PhD MDs, PsyDs, stuff that probably Anna actually knows way more about than I do, because the research can like dovetail with other fields pretty, sometimes cleanly, sometimes less cleanly. I will say make sure your program is one that you've talked to people about and that you know is going to give you what you want. I think in STEM especially, something to worry about sometimes is the one-year master's program that's sometimes considered a stepping stone. There are some institutions where that kind of program, in STEM at least, is something to watch out for. It's often a way for schools to make a lot of money off of students, and that MA isn't necessarily going to be the stepping stone always that you think it is. But in STEM, like in STEM and I expect other fields, thinking about 2 years master's programs or else a post-bac, or even just working in that field. So I worked as a research assistant and then a lab manager, and I found that way more helpful as a transition. But that kind of guided me as well into the right kind of program. And that's a lot of sort of very specific contextual knowledge about like where you want to end up. That's often helpful and that you can pick up through something like a post-bac or a sort of longer master's or a job.
Yeah, just to follow up with what he said, especially about a post-bac for something like medicine, I would recommend a post-bac program. You can get a master's if you're very interested in biology or microbiology. I have plenty of colleagues and peers who have all done master's programs or had work experience. But for me, not knowing exactly what I wanted to do in healthcare at that time and not having all of the prerequisites, St. John's is a wonderful foray and exploration into the history of math and sciences, but there's just some practical organic chemistry, biochemistry that you have to know. You need to know it for the MCAT, you need to know it for physiology, that we just don't really get in the program. But even more than that, you meet peers who are interested in doing different things. So I wasn't sure if I wanted to be a physician's assistant or a doctor, but for me, I wanted that leadership role. I wanted to have the medical license and to be ultimately in charge of patient care. But I had to weigh that against an extra year and an extra $60,000 of graduate school. And whether or not I wanted to do that. So doing a post-bac or talking with people who you know are in your field can be really, really helpful if you don't know exactly where you want to go or exactly what kind of degree you want. That's okay. Just get started, find a community of like-minded people, and it'll all sort of fall into place. At least that's what I found. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that's sort of funny perhaps about my trajectory as opposed to my fellow panelists is I feel as though there's a practical application or like a clear trajectory provided by many of the paths you've chosen. And the thing with an MFA and the thing with writing is the reality is an MFA is, while it's a terminal degree, there are very few teaching positions at the college level, and there are many more MFA graduates. So while some aspire to teach at the college level, it's certainly not a guarantee. And to be a writer is also not something that many people support themselves off of alone. So they typically complement that with working in publishing, with teaching at the high school level. So it's not the most practical degree to get, but the good news is, like I've mentioned, most programs are fully funded. So you get a modest stipend that probably, depends on looking at the cost of living of whichever city you'll be in, but for Boise, Idaho is a livable stipend for me. And really it buys me time to explore my own writing, and I'm, situated among faculty, mentors, and peers who are really excited about any path students want to take. So there's a lot of time for experimentation, a lot of opportunities to, pull professors in for like independent study projects. So as opposed to my peers on this panel, I think the MFA route is less applicable to things immediately follow. Like, you don't get this degree to ensure that you have a job, but if you approach it in the right way, you can make sure that you are comfortable, that you're not going into debt, and that you are allowing yourself additional time to simply relish and explore your own creative voice.
That sounds amazing, Kelsey. Honestly, sounds lovely.
So does a job after graduation, but we'll see. I have 3 years to figure it out.
I will say that is something that I guess was sort of left more to implication in one of the things I said, which is make sure the kind of program or degree type you're going into matches with your goals afterwards. So for example, I'm in a PhD program. The field is a little bit more wide open. Like, it doesn't track me into a specific job the way like maybe getting a PsyD to become like a clinical practitioner would have. I do more sort of theoretical and experimental stuff, and that's really, I mean, it depends on the kind of person you are and how definite you want your goals to be. It's either nerve-wrackingly free or excitingly free. For me, it's exciting because there's a lot of different jobs that I can do with that. But a lot of that then means the impetus for what comes after falls back to you near the end of your program, which is important to think about ahead of time, as opposed to like a much more specific program or degree, even something like what Kat mentioned with like a joint PhD and JD program. Obviously, that's going to be more focused in terms of what your work is. So that breadth of options or that specificity of options is also something to think about when comparing the kinds of programs that you might read about.
So now we thought we'd like to get into nuts and bolts, practical guidance for applying to graduate school. And so we have a number of different topics we would like to break it into. And so I'd like to start with personal statements. If a few of you can talk about the goals and how it may be different from a research statement, a tip maybe to make your personal statement stand out in a good way. So if a few of you could address personal statements, that'd be great.
Yeah, I have a thought about that, just because I think maybe a little bit unusually, I've actually gotten feedback back from the admissions committees for both George Mason, where I applied to the physics department there, and then also at Cornell. I think partly because I'd worked at both places. So when I applied, they'd already known me. And so they felt comfortable, I think, talking a little bit more about the process sort of behind the scenes. I think the most important thing, honestly, is to make sure you have a clear, coherent, compelling story in your personal statement. It needs to have a beginning, middle, and end. Go back to Aristotle. It needs to somehow communicate to the admissions committee that you make sense to them as a candidate and they make sense for you. That this is really kind of like destiny unfolding in a way that is best for everyone. I think being able to show in your personal statement what kind of either a researcher you are, or having spoken to people who applied even in different fields, just like the quality of your thinking is also super important. And I think the big thing is, again, show, don't tell in your personal statement. They're going to see your CV. So I think really focus on that story element of it is what I would want to emphasize.
Yeah, for MFA apps, I think some of the content is a little different. I think you have a little bit more freedom, since it's a creative program, to adopt a voice that maybe doesn't need to feel as formal. But the advice that I think applies more broadly look at the length. For MFAs, the length varied greatly. It was as short as like 500 words, which is really tricky, and up to like 3 pages. So I kind of distilled down the crux, like what is the heart of my statement? What is like the necessary thing that would be in the shortest statement? And then when I had a bit more space, I obviously had some extraneous bits that I liked that were maybe a little more flowery or provided more backstory, but felt important to me, and I would add those back in. What I did for MFAs, which of course you have to find a genuine way to do this, which the entire premise of a personal statement is sort of like so artificial, and you're trying to find a way to be genuine through that, and you just have to like get over that. But is I would actually explicitly mention things particular to each program. It may be particularly so in MFA programs, but I get the sense that there are some people who just apply to like 30 schools and they just send things out everywhere, and don't even really look into the school prior to doing so, or they look back at the rankings and there are kind of these, 20, 30 schools that everyone like knows of or thinks of first. And they're taking you on for 2 to 3 years, maybe even funding you for 4 years. They're by and large really small cohorts, so you're going to be getting to know the faculty. And I think reading their work and talking about stylistically, formally, what some of the poets who are there are doing, or things like some programs will let you take courses in other departments or will require that you take a class in a genre that is not your genre. Just mentioning some of these like particular aspects that are unique to that program that show that you've spent a little bit of time like delving into and thinking about why that program might be a fit for you, rather than just saying everyone loves your program and it's really well esteemed and I want to be in New York City because that's cool and that's where writers are and great people teach there. Actually like getting into specificity, I think indicates a genuine interest that goes a long way.
This is pretty nitty gritty, but as you're filling out a med school application, you're going to be asked to fill in sort of buckets for leadership experiences, academic experiences, volunteerism, or work experience. I kept a running spreadsheet of all the things that I was going to do, and I picked from one of those experiences. So to kind of highlight that genuineness, like one of those things that really stood out to me as an important experience, and also something that had a beginning, middle, and end, a story that I remembered, something I could tell. I thought that was great advice from both of you. And then the other thing that I did that was particularly useful is I had lots of different people read my personal statement, which was mortifying, especially the first draft. It was absolutely terrifying. I included my family, my sister who's a writer. I got all sorts of different advice from different people. Stay true to you, but the more eyes you have on it, the more they're going, and the more people that know you, the more you're going to be able to highlight those aspects of yourself, catch all those grammar mistakes that you really can't make. And then in particular, I had a med student, somebody I happened to know who was a year ahead of me in the application process. And he was able to refine some of that language so that it presented to like a medical school panel that's going to have physicians on it and going to have clinicians on it reading. So make sure that the language is appropriate to the school or whatever it is that you're applying to as well.
2 quick things that I think just popped into my head based on what Anna just said, actually. One, the diversity of people that she just said, amazing. That's definitely what you should do. Some of the best advice I've ever gotten on my personal statements for obviously STEM-based programs, but also STEM-based research fellowships actually came from public policy and law school people on this campus. They just, don't just fall into the tropes and traditions of your own field. Your writing is going to be improved when you ask people who are good at writing from lots of different perspectives.
Building off of the getting people to read it after you write it, I would also recommend talking to people about you before you write it. So something I did with mine, because it's just a horribly general question about yourself and why you want to do this thing you want to do. And you might have thoughts that are disjointed. I talked to almost everybody I knew about myself and talk to them about sort of what stories were the best stories for me to focus on. And it helped me really clarify my thinking. I didn't go with everything that, my mom suggested or a friend who was in marine biology suggested, but it helped me figure out what story I wanted to tell and how to tell it in a way that's genuine to my experience and people's experience of me, which I think is important to think about when you're trying to distill yourself into a page and a half. Just a thought before you start on your big writing journey. Also have a copy editor look at it. If you have any copy editors that that's like the final step. Throw it at a copy editor. They're the best.
Amrit, I wonder if you might address, as writing for, a STEM field, how you tell a story. There was a question that came up about what does it mean to present yourself through a story in a personal statement? And a lot of times I hear narrative too. That's something that we say a lot in personal statement writing.
Sure. I assume for a STEM like admissions committee. Yeah. I think I really do mean it in the genuine sense of a story about yourself. I think it's trying to hit what Kelsey said earlier. Like there's a lot of formal constraints, especially on our applications, if not as much, obviously for the MFAs, but communicating authentically about yourself and telling a story where the natural next step is their program makes for a very convincing personal statement, whether that's for grad school or for funding. Just to be more concrete and give kind of like an example, for the physics program, I told the story of these are the questions that I care about, and this is why I care about them, and this is how I came to want to ask these questions in this setting. Honestly, I think the story I told for sort of a more psychology and neuroscience based audience included the story of changing my mind away from physics. And that can be a bit dicey because the other thing that people are reading your personal statements for longer programs is also stick-to-itiveness. So, be careful how you write these things. But I told a story where it was a story of, I cared enough about this stuff that I, went out and did one job for a year and another job for 2 years just to really make sure that this is what I care about and wanted to commit to. And, one of the admissions committee members said, oh, that was, that I believed you when you said that. Like, oh, we knew you were going to stick to it. And that's something that's important to those committee members. Like for a 5-year program, you don't want to admit a bunch of people who are just going to leave after 3 years because like, oh man, I didn't actually want to do this. That's always an option that's available to you, but just know that that's one of the things that they're thinking about. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got kind of a curveball. If possible, this was very doable for my program. If possible, have the conversation with your admissions director or with the head of the program. So I actually got to basically be softballed in admission before I submitted my package, entirely because I said, I'm just, I don't know. Junior year, I read Locke, all about ownership. I am on fire to understand what people do when they think they own something. What does it mean to own something? How do people live their lives differently? And I think business is the best place to understand that because that's where most people interact with that. Now, that could also be a great personal statement for an MA in Marxism, right? But it got refined because I had a then undergrad, a friend of mine who was a year under but had done an MA in English Lit, and a friend of mine who was 2 years into his PhD and working in a bunch of federal departments, each read my personal statement for different things. And the bottom line was, it was fine. Keep it simple, keep it sweet. You're there for plausibility. Could you plausibly fit into the program? What's the credential behind that claim? And also to leave them with something where they think some sentence about you, right? Because they read a bunch of these. And if you go into it thinking, oh, I need to make this compelling, you're going to lose your mind. You need to go in and, as tripe as it might sound, be your most authentic self. if you love gardening and it's weird and you think it's weird and all your friends think it's weird, but you really love it, talk a little bit about that and how that feeds into this other passionate bit of your life. That's what I tell everyone who now I help that business school interview people. And that's what I tell everyone. It's tell me something quirky about you that I wouldn't know off this application.
Thank you. That's all really great advice. I'd like to move on to letters of recommendation. It's another crucial piece of your application. Who are the best people to ask? Does it matter who you're asking and who writes your letter, depending on your program or department, and how and when to ask for letters of recommendation?
I think asking as soon as possible, giving the recommenders as much bandwidth, like as much runway, and giving them a heads up also in case it seems like there isn't a fit, giving yourself time to find someone else. I think also you see this in MFA apps, but I'm sure it's also applicable to others. Some people can get big names to write them letters of rec. Like you do a weekend workshop where you pay to attend, but it's with someone who has a big name, and then you ask them to write a letter of rec, and perhaps they agree, but it's going to feel very not personal. It's going to feel like a sort of templated letter. Likewise, I could imagine if you didn't have a close relationship with the school's president or the dean and you ask them to write you a letter of rec, they may say yes, but I think the content of that letter, it's going to be clear to the admissions committee who's reading so many of these, that it's not filled with the sort of particular details and kind of like enthusiastic insight that a tutor who knows you well will be able to provide. So I think just trying to think about like who actually knows you well and can speak to certain attributes. And, if you're having an open conversation with them, I've even had St. John's tutors say to me, are there any attributes you want me particularly to focus on? Because I know MFA, like, are there things that you want me to focus on because they are different programs. So if you have good rapport and you have enough time, you might even be able to kind of collaborate with them and make sure that you understand which aspects of your profile they will be highlighting. So you can kind of think of complementary voices.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay. I can sort of speak to this from two perspectives. I run an internship program, or have run an internship program. And I know I can tell immediately who knows you and who doesn't. That's very, very clear to me. So from this perspective, I know who knows you, I know who doesn't know you. Also, think about if the person you're asking to write your recommendation letter is someone you like, whether or not they like you. I have gotten some recommendation letters for students that the person, it's just clear that they know each other, but it's not really a nice relationship, if that makes sense. Not that it's bad, but it's just sort of often an ego-obsessed professor, and this person sort of knows them and was a good student, but this professor is interested in themselves. It's not a good recommendation letter. When it came to me, something to think about for law school, almost all of my cohort have had a job before they went to law school. So that's something to think about. I would highly recommend trying some other things, or going to be a paralegal, just getting some work experience under your belt. I used my boss as one of my recommendation letters, and I think that was a very strong recommendation letter because he could speak to me both as a person and as an employee, and what kind of employee I would be after I graduated law school. So I picked a wonderful St. John's student that could speak to me academically, but I also had someone who could speak to what kind of employee I am. He even asked, are you sure you want to do this? Okay, well then I think that you're the kind of lawyer we need, so I will write you a recommendation letter. And that's the sort of attitude you want from a recommender. Someone who thinks, yes, I think you can do this and I want you to do this. And that's what you want.
Yeah, that brings to mind a couple of pretty important principles that I think matter to me just because I've been both, on the side of asking for recommendations, but also reading recommendations when I was a lab manager. And, as you progress through grad school, you become one of the people that starts contributing to letters of recommendation, if not writing them at some point. Something important is based on what both Kelsey and Kat said, make sure when you're asking, you ask in a very clear and explicit way, can you write me a strong, recommendation for me? That's something to get clear about, because they can throw in every superlative in the world and it's not going to matter exactly for the reasons that Kat just said. The second thing is, remember to think about your letters of recommendation as part of an application package. You don't have to do all the work in each separate component. So I like what Kat said. It's really important. It was really important for me to also ask for letters of recommendation from different aspects of experience. So I had tutors, internship mentors, and employers as well. And I think that builds a more holistic picture. Obviously, you're gonna do the work to make sure the relationship is there to get a strong yes, but you don't want a lackluster or even kind of damning letter of recommendation, which does happen. So you're gonna want to be careful how you ask, who you ask, and where you're drawing from.
Yeah, can they tell a story about you is really my way of choosing. Do you have someone who can tell a good story about who you are? If they can just say, oh, Kat's great, that's probably not the right person to ask.
Yeah, the best recommender is someone who, when you ask, says, I would sing your praises to the moon. Are you kidding? Of course I would. And when you find one of those people, they could be the guy you did a gardening job for, over the course of years, right? Like that person for me happens to be an old property management client of mine who, we've known each other now 5 or so years, and we've worked together delightfully for all that time, right? And yeah, I don't know, it's not a Fortune 500 company, right? But I owned it, I run it, and she was a big part of that. And that's the kind of person you want, right? Someone that you've had this relationship, because what the recommender wants to know is this someone who's going to show up on time, do a good job, and be personable and be, vaguely interesting. And honestly, the vaguely interesting part, at least for, business, frankly, is sort of low on the totem pole. What really matters is are you going to show up on time, and are you going to do the job competently? And I would hire that person over the interesting person 9 times out of 10.
Thank you all. I think so. Interviews is the next topic on our list, and I know for not all graduate programs offer or have interviews, but for those of you that had an interview or have some guidance or advice, I'd like for you all to comment on those if you could.
Yeah, I can get the ball rolling. You are going to do interviews so an acceptance for medical school is an acceptance to come interview. So you're going to do an interview with every single school. There are different formats. You can do a one-on-one interview, but schools are actually moving away from that into this sort of MMI format where you're actually with a small group. You sort of move through almost like speed dating or like a round robin kind of thing. It can be really stressful because there are other people in the room with you. And you'll get everything from why do you want to be a doctor? Tell me your greatest weakness, to an ethical situation. There's 1 bag of blood, 3 people need it. Who are you going to give it to, and justify that? So be prepared for questions that you wouldn't think are directly related to why I want to go to school, why I want to do this program. They're going to ask you to think out of the box for for medical school. And mostly they want to see that you're thoughtful. They want to see that you're polite and that you have really good communication skills, right? These are things that you're going to need as a physician. These are things you're going to need as a professional. So just trying not to get flustered, practicing, and, remembering that it's more about how you present yourself than it is about what you say, to a point, is, I think, really good advice.
Yeah, one thing I just want to mention, Perhaps it was the word speed dating just kind of made it pop out. But one thing to be careful for in terms of STEM interviews for grad school is I see a lot of people fall into this idea that the applying to a STEM program, and which usually means applying to a lab, is about impressing people. And that goes the other way too. The PI, the principal investigators, the people who lead the labs, they're going to be trying to impress you too. If they've invited you for an interview, that means they're interested enough to want you. So they're going to be putting their best foot forward, which, is great and awesome. But you need to think about the interview as also essentially an information gathering procedure as well. You don't just want to get yeses from everybody. I know that sounds counterintuitive. You want to use the interview to find out, is this a place I do actually want to go to? Like, it looked good on paper when I was researching the schools, but you should ask questions during the interview that help you figure out, is this a place I want to be? And that means, try to not just interview faculty, try to interview current students in the department, and sort of ask them about department culture or lab culture. Sometimes that can mean reaching out to people who've already graduated from that program or from that lab and asking them what their experience has been. And, due to all the different kinds of pressures or like social feelings or sometimes nostalgia, all of that, it's helpful to get input from people in the program and out of the program. But I do think avoid a kind of like blind date scenario where you're both trying to impress each other and you hide all the weird stuff and then you break up like a year later and you regret the whole thing because you're like, man, that first date could have been a lot more sort of forthright. So I think use the interview to get information, not just to, obviously make a good impression, but not just to do that.
Yeah, my experience was similar. And also, I think the schools that interview, not all do, only do so for candidates I think that they're pretty much ready to accept, and just it's really a compatibility check. I think unlike Nicholas's experience, they really, I mean, they're more interested in getting along with you because this isn't about graduating like proficient into the workplace, but it's more about like having a lot of conversations with other poets. And when the cohort is 2 or 3 people per year, I think the interviewing other students is so key, because I was fortunate to have a number of schools to choose from. And I found talking to current students quite illuminating, and actually like some people who were like quite critical of their current program, or even not aware of how critical they were coming off, but maybe like sort of entitled or expectant and about like everything more that should be done. And just like, I don't know, I felt like it was actually surprisingly easy to get a sense of like the like emotional texture behind these really small cohorts of people, and what the relationship is like with the faculty, and what the relationship, if it's competitive among students, or if like workshop is a more collaborative place. And maybe this transitions us to funding, but also some schools have different awards and different amounts for each student. So finding things out like that are a huge indicator to like, are you all competing for like the next round of funding in your second year, or does like everyone have exactly the same? But if someone else wanted to talk about interviews, please.
Yeah. I have one last thing on that, Kelsey. The best advice I got on interviewing was interview early, interview often. And for me, that boiled down to taking job interviews when I didn't really have real intention of taking the job, right? But instead it was, I want to learn, what are my hiccups going to be? Because if I'm only batting 350, I know most of the time I step up to the plate, I'm not going to hit the ball, right? And if you're worried about how you interface with people and how you present yourself, it's a lot easier to get a handle on that in low threshold interviews, whether that's for schools you don't particularly want to go to, which, I don't know how you feel about that, or if that's for a job that you're like, I don't know, it'd be kind of cool if I got it, but I don't care. I'm just going to show up. I'm going to look good, and we're going to find out what happens. Because then you learn about different methods of interviewing, right? You're going to learn about the STAR method. You're going to learn that people have this wackadoodle Google thing, right, where they're going to throw some crazy curveball at you. Or you're going to learn that they're just going to invite you over for lunch and say, so tell me about your day. And any of these things could happen, right? It's not going to be clear, but the more used you are to encountering each of these, the easier it's going to be for you to present your real self in the middle of the interview in a low stress way.
Yeah, actually, it's interesting because like I'm hearing like the important differences in the interview dynamics as well. So obviously, based on what I said before, STEM interviews I think should operate a little bit differently, but I think there's a lot of that influence of like your best impression and like making a practice thing. One other thing just to note, like many of the other parts of like a STEM program application, the interview is also a chance for them to see you think live. It's not the case that people are going to have ready to go questions. They're probably going to talk to you and they're just going to want to chat and see how you think about things in a casual manner, because you know so much of science, at least of the sort that I've done, is about talking to people and knowing that you can talk to people about ideas, you know, in the hallway, and maybe something comes of that, maybe something doesn't, but like how comfortable and good are you at like sort of casually thinking rigorously about interesting and different things, sometimes in your field, sometimes in your ballpark, but sometimes not. And, you know, they're going to know that based on who you are and what information you've given to them. But, you know, and again, I want to emphasize, they're going to be doing that to you. You should also be doing that to them. You should also be keeping track of, you know, is this a conversation style that I feel good about? Is this the kind of conversation that I want to have for the next 5 years? Is this the kind of conversation partner I want? And just like a couple of concrete things, because I think the concrete examples that Kelsey and Nick gave were really good. Like one interview I had was literally we just thought through an experiment that person just threw out like that day, and we were just thinking about it. It's like a thing that I knew a little bit about, but not very much, and we just talked about that for a while. Another person I only realized after the fact was a little bit quizzing me about like a literature that we both happen to like be familiar with. But then 2 of the interviews, we just had a nice conversation. Can't really tell you what the conversation was about, but it was a nice conversation. So be ready for anything. But yeah, the STEM interviews are also a place to like, for them to gauge you and you to gauge them on how the conversations are and what kind of conversations you're going to want to have.
I just want to add one final thing, and I don't know if this is unique to med school or not, but when you're on the campus of wherever you're going, every moment that you're on that campus is an interview. If you're interacting with other students, they're going to be watching and seeing how you fit in. So it's not about game day in front of the interviewer and then acting, you know, maybe in a way that you wouldn't find very dignified, or saying things that you think are personal to a fellow student or even a friend who's in the program ahead of you. Everyone talks. So make sure that when you're going through the interview process, be open and honest, but also remember that they're watching you all the time. And you're making an impression of yourself throughout your entire visit on that campus, whether that's an introduction, a campus tour, whoever you're talking with in the admissions department, all of that information is collated and is tied to your name. So little word for the wise.
That's actually a really good point. That is also absolutely true for my fields. That nice coffee and that nice dinner you went to is definitely a way to welcome you. It's also a way for them afterwards to have a powwow together and be like, do we want this person? So everybody, yeah, it's gonna be fine, but everybody's paying attention. Yeah.
Thank you. That's some great advice. And like we said, not every program has interviews. And so you may or may not find yourself in that situation, depending on, you know, law schools do not typically have interviews. And I don't think you would have, Kat.
I had one.
Okay.
But no, it's not typical. I didn't have interviews for every law school I got into. And the one I had was not really an interview. It was a group of people dealing with a problem together and somebody watching us. So that's not what other law school interviews are like if you get them. It just really depends, like Amrit said, on who you're dealing with.
That's right. Thank you. We want to wrap up this section talking about financials, meaning, it can be expensive to apply to graduate school and programs, from everything from standardized tests to application fees. So I wonder if you all can comment on things that, either strategies you used or advice or guidance for some of the financial piece of applying to graduate school.
Yeah, applying to law school is expensive. Something I really don't like about it is how expensive it is and what a barrier that is. You should be aware that there are waivers for all the fees that you'll get in applying. So if you are in dire financial straits, you can still apply to law school. That is something that can happen and you don't have to pay. However, I did have a full-time job. I paid full price for all of my tests and applications. I think I applied to about 8 schools. And it was close to about $1,000. I think it was $850 to apply to my schools, and I took the LSAT twice. And then a little bit more on that I got an LSAT book, I think. But yeah, it's very expensive.
Not every school asks for the GRE. Those that have asked for the GRE mostly do so because the graduate college requires it, and the MFA does not care at all. And they definitely don't care about your math score. I would say it mostly got waived in COVID, but I had taken the GRE and I almost saw it as a competitive advantage that some people who just didn't want to take the test wouldn't take the test and then wouldn't apply to those, would be less likely to apply to those fully funded programs. So I thought that the acceptance rate might be a little bit more in my favor by shrinking the pool. So I didn't really study for the GRE, and I just went in and took it and knew that I had enough, standardized tests in my background to be fine. That aside, application fees range from 55 up to 110. That's rare. Most of them are 85 or below. There are a handful of schools, all of which I applied to, that really lovely do 2 phases. So you just submit your manuscript and your personal statement, and the manuscript is really the bulk of what they're assessing. I think 80% or maybe even greater is just about your writing or your creative work. So they just look at your creative work and your a brief personal statement, and then they only advance you to the second phase if they really see themselves accepting you. You don't get the exact numbers. And then you do the letter of rec and you order your transcripts and you fill everything else out. There are some fee waivers, but I have heard that they're hard to get, and I certainly didn't qualify for any of them. So I would also say if you're going to apply to more than 5 schools, you're probably going to spend close to $1,000, if not more.
I think that estimate also holds true for STEM. As far as number of applications, I know that based on my cohorts and friends, I think the average is around 8 for STEM programs. Usually people apply to. They're going to cost about what Kelsey just said, anywhere from 50 to about 110, probably falling closer around to somewhere between 80 and 90. Only take tests that your school requires you to. There's no need to stress yourself out and pay more money than you need to. GREs are increasingly not required, but make sure you know exactly what is required or what is not required, as well as what might make your application more or less strong. I had a very sort of ambivalent experience of this. My department did not care at all about my GRE scores, whereas my GMU admissions committee said that was partly why they accepted me, was my GRE scores. But that was because of sort of downstream issues regarding how people get selected for fellowships and stuff. So sometimes the numbers matter depending on the kind of department and what the money situation inside the department can be as well. But make sure you only take what's required, because you'll also find out for STEM that there's, and I think for some humanities fields, there's also subject tests. Most places probably won't require you to take them. Find out if you need to. They will also, of course, cost more money. And make sure to budget for the tests as well, because if you think that you either need a really good score or that it would really help you in a particular application, you're going to want to take it as few times as possible and make sure you're like very prepared. I remember I just went to Jamie's office and I asked for a GRE practice book. I did it like 5 or 6 times, and then I went to go take the GREs, and that really helped because one thing to also keep in mind, the GREs are not a content-based test. They are interested in how many questions you can answer correctly as fast as you can. So really time yourself while doing the practice tests. But a lot of that will affect the budget. I think what Kelsey said about if you're doing like the full gamut, it'll probably be about $1,000 as well. But fee waivers and all that stuff, of course, is also available depending on your particular socioeconomic background.
I don't want to scare anyone, but med school is a little bit different. So the number of schools you apply to is probably double that. So you'd need to probably double your budget. That's a good guesstimate. There are waivers and fees available. They're not always easy to come by. But if you go onto AAMC website, they'll have a lot of that information for you. The MCAT is about $300 and $350, I think. I had to take it twice. I also needed to take a prep course, which can range from like $20,000 private tutoring, which some people do, which is crazy, to just getting some books online used. It's what I did. I used Princeton Review materials and went through them. Give yourself the time. It's not just money sometimes, but time to do that as well. And then because the MCAT is very content-based, you're going to have to take like a post-bac and get some of those prerequisites. So I ended up taking 6 semesters at Cal, each of which was roughly $5,000. I was taking maybe 4 or 5 units. And I did that over a few years. And to deal with the pinch, I moved back home. I'm from the Bay Area. So use the resources that you have available. You can take out loans, but families, if you can do that, will help. Or, living at home, just finding ways to kind of save money for yourself. Remember, you're investing in your future. And if you really want it, it's worth it. Yeah.
Yeah, just a shout out on that side. Use your community colleges. You can get incredible, in particular in-county tuition sometimes. In California, you can get a lot of things for free, frankly, was my recollection. And Anne Arundel Community College is a great school too. If you need to do some further work, figure out how you can do it at a place that has, a public stamp on it and is very inexpensive. And you might be very pleasantly surprised by what happens.
Just before I forget, one more thing about testing, and for me particularly the LSAT. You probably should study. I'm pretty good at standardized tests, but the LSAT is just a different one. So I would recommend, if you know somebody who has an LSAT book, I'd recommend going to Jamie. I'm pretty sure she's got LSAT books. I would recommend just doing it over and over again. I didn't find the tips as helpful as just taking practice tests. But also, because the rankings are based on LSAT scores, partially at law schools. Law schools really want you to have a high LSAT score. And if you go to a mid-ranked law school with a high LSAT score, they might pay for you because they want to push their rankings up. So just something to think about, really working hard on that, because even like a 167, 168 or above will really help you get some money, which is unlike a lot of other people on this panel. Law school is not automatically funded. It is quite expensive, and that's part of the racket. But you can get scholarships, and a lot of it is going to have to do with your LSAT score. So just start thinking about that.
Yeah, just to add on to this, just because it's the financials part, be very aware of, in STEM, if you're going for a sort of longer degree, like a PhD that's often funded, make sure you do the math in your head about how much they're paying you versus how much it costs to live where the school is. I think a lot of people sometimes forget to do that quick calculation, and they can be a little bit surprised come the fall where you're going to start. The other thing is the thing Kat just said about your scores sometimes affecting how attractive of a candidate you are and like affecting funding. That was essentially the reason why that was like one of the reasons why the physics department really looked kindly on the GRE scores that I had. Was the claim was that there's a lot of physics-based funding that sometimes really is quantitatively based. So if you happen to fall, in a particular area of the bell curve in your field, you're more likely to get funding, which makes your department look good, which makes you a more attractive candidate to that department. But again, it probably differs very much on department culture, department resources, and like a lot of that other stuff. Yeah.
So I think I want to move into final thoughts from each panelist, something that you wish you had known or advice you have for people that either whether you're a current student or you're a fellow alum who hasn't applied to grad school yet, but any advice or final thoughts, and then we'll move into the Q&A. So quick final thought from everyone before we do that.
I have a hyper practical one, making a spreadsheet to keep track of all due dates. For me, like different programs wanted official transcripts, others would take copies, just like when everything is due, how long the personal statements are. It wasn't streamlined and it's not all run on one system. And there are different links, like they all have their own logins. So just keeping one like source of truth where you can immediately jump to and like see how many personal statements you get to write over 2 pages, how many have to be, what's the shortest one? Does anyone want a supplementary like English essay or expository essay? So just do yourself a favor and kind of store all of the to-dos in as readily accessible and easy to navigate a place you can.
Mine is a little bit about the application process and a little bit after. Try not to freak yourself out. I stumbled onto law school Reddit. Wouldn't recommend it. Wasn't helpful. Mostly was just upsetting. I'm into my first semester of law school. I do not think that for me, it would have been helpful to read a lot of books about what law school is like. I think going in as a St. John's student was the best preparation I could have had. And the things that I did read didn't help me in the way they were meant to. So just, especially for law school, there are a lot of people whose whole jobs are getting people into law school and scaring people about law school. So don't freak yourself out. You'll be okay. As a St. John's student especially, you already know what kind of work this is, and you will be a good law student. So it'll be all right.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, I think the thing I found most helpful through the entire journey from graduation to now, graduating medical school next year, I talked to a lot of people. I picked a lot of different people's brains about everything. And I got very comfortable going up to a person and just saying, hey, I'm interested in this. I'm having a conversation. It looks like you do this. I think as St. John's alums, we're uniquely, sort of qualified to ask a good opening question, right? Listen actively, learn to think on what you've had and to express yourself really clearly. And a lot of people go through this. You're not the first person who has asked. You won't be the last person who has asked. So any sort of reservations you have, oh, this is awkward, don't worry about it. It's probably happened to these people before. It'll continue to happen. And most people are really nice and super happy to help. That was overwhelmingly what I found. Anytime I asked for advice, people were happy to give it. I didn't always take it, but everyone was really happy to sort of give it. And no one never had a bad experience trying to pick someone's brain.
It's also I'm sorry, go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback off of what Anna said. I found my program by talking about my sort of career trajectory with the clerk at a bookstore in DC who paused for a long time after I told her where I was and how I didn't really know what I wanted to do, and said, you know, my older brother went to a wackadoodle school like you did, and then he went to this business program, and now he's doing these really amazing things. Maybe you should call them and see what's going on. And it turned out that she was the daughter of a professor in that program also, which she did not mention at the time. And we only pieced that together like 8 months later. And that was all, wild. But the more you tell people and the more you share what it is that you think you might want to do, the more you'll be stunned at how you find allies and friends who just pop out of the woodwork, right? People who really want to help you get somewhere cool. You might not know what that looks like, but they're willing to say, hey, have you looked at this? And then the second thing I'd say is just a visit if you can. Even cold, don't make it a big formal thing. Just walk on campus and poke around and see what happens. The Mid-Atlantic in particular is great for that, just because everything's so close and you can visit so many different places with or without a car. So if you find yourself there, it's way easier to do everything.
Some other stuff that I'd probably think is important to keep in mind is there's no rush. It's essentially a project of finding a place that's going to help you grow and develop into the kind of person that you want to grow and develop into, which is why some of that like front-loaded work of thinking about that ahead of time is really useful. And time that you spend in between working jobs or gaining experience in like relevant fields is only going to make you a stronger candidate and make grad school honestly a lot less scary. For what it's worth, in my cohort of 10 people, even after working for 3 years before going to grad school, I still am in the younger half of the cohort. Like grad school is starting to reflect the fact that people actually are taking the time to think about it before going. So don't feel rushed. Rushing is not going to help you most of the time. And I think that idea about having conversations is really important. I definitely feel like I was set up for as much success as possible by having a lot of conversations with alumni and mentors. Reach out to us. We're pretty much always ready to help you guys or have a conversation. The offices at both schools are a very good resource. Please get to know everybody who is hosting this call or making this call happen very well. Jamie's support and the resources she was able to offer played a super important part of me being able to experience different internships, sort of have an idea of like, what did the last one help me with, think ahead about like what the next one can help me with. And like I said, like sometimes very, very concrete resources like that GRE practice book or like the advice they have about personal statements or CVs or all that, super helpful. Use what is available to you, which is the alumni, the offices, and honestly, lots of people that you might just have conversations with.
And actually, Kelsey reminded me there's one final bit of advice, something that I didn't do that I wish I'd done, which is you do have these career services offices. If you're not sure what you want to do, but you think you might want to do grad school and you've made a connection with the tutor, you can get a letter of recommendation now while you're still a fresh student and that relationship is fresh. You can put it in a little folder and then it can be updated 3 years from now, but all of that foundation is there. And that's what career services is for. They can help you kind of curate your CV, curate your portfolio as you move through. So again, have experiences, grow, develop, figure out who you want to be. And as you have those experiences, get those letters of rec and just curate that. And then you can decide a little bit later. So thank you, Kelsey, for reminding me.
I would also like to say, do as many internships as you can, especially if you're not sure what you want to do. I think that was pretty much the number one most helpful thing for me in terms of figuring out what I wanted to do. And also, supporting myself after St. John's. I got a job from an internship that I had on a Hodson fellowship, an unpaid internship. So really, take advantage of pathways, take advantage of Hodson. I don't know what it is in Santa Fe. I know there are equivalents. Really try things. It might not be the exact right thing, but even as early, I wish I had done an internship or taken some classes my freshman year. That's the one regret. Kelsey is saying it's aerial and global pathways. So if you're a freshman, I say, think about something you're interested in. See if you can get an internship or see if you can take a class in it. I think that was the best thing I did when I was at St. John's for this.
And thank you. Thank you for the plug for our offices too. Whether you're a current student or an alum, you can always come back and use the resources on campus, either campus. So we really want to encourage you to do that. Thank you all. Thank you, the panelists. I wonder if there are any questions from the audience that you'd like to ask any of our panelists or all of them. If there are things that you're curious about or want to follow up on some of the things they said or advice or guidance, the floor is open. Maybe you all were so thorough that you covered everything.
You're sharing contact information, our contact information if we agreed. Yeah, so if anybody has a question at any time, they have my contact information. If you're interested in med school or anything like that, I'm happy to answer questions and to help if you need.
Yeah, one of the really helpful things I did like as the very, very first step is I was at a writing conference, and there was a woman who had gone through an MFA and was a Stanger fellow at Stanford. So she was teaching a lot of undergrads who were then being placed in MFA programs. And I just sat next to her in the cafeteria and went through a bunch of schools that I sort of knew about from the fully funded list, and just got her impression because of the unreliability of rankings, and it's just hard to even know where to start because there are 200 fully funded programs. So if anyone wants a massive spreadsheet or wants just my general take and my inherited takes that I've gotten from her, or anything specific to MFA programs, or I suppose English programs, you can feel free to reach out to me.
I will say I am in my first semester of law school. I will tell you anything you want to know about the application process. I can only tell you about the first semester of law school so far, but I would love to speak to anyone who's thinking about applying or has questions about applying. And also, if anyone wants to know about careers in being a contractor in the federal government, or anything having to do with history or archives, I can at least point you towards the right place for that.
That's actually a really good point, Kat. Same here. Doing a PhD or getting an advanced degree in science is one way to participate in the scientific process. There are lots of different ways. I've occupied a couple different roles in that capacity, but there's loads of stuff like science communication, science journalism, science history. There's loads of paths. So I'm also happy to talk about the fact that you could do this in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I don't know, business school, it's okay. If you want to talk about startups, and particular startups focused on circular economy and environmental concerns, I'm here all day. If you also want to talk about impact investing and ethical ways of nonprofit involvement, I have my hands in a couple of those places too. And I don't know, I have a 9-to-5, but that's the kind of stuff that gives me life. It's pretty cool. So, go find something. Decide right now whether or not you want to get your sort of energy from your 9-to-5, or you want to have side projects, right? That really helps to focus your attention.
Well, maybe there's some. I don't know if you all can all see the question that was posed. One panelist whose bio stated they didn't know whether to study physics or cognitive science, and they studied both before choosing cognitive science. How did that happen? That cost you more? I think probably referring to Amrit.
Yes, though honestly, I feel like a bunch of us tried out a lot of stuff. It did not cost me more money. I made money. which is another great reason to try and explore a bit before you go to grad school, because having a little nest egg ahead of time is, just it's pretty nice. And maybe the others can speak to this a little bit more. At least with science, there are paid positions. They are hard to get. They are competitive. You will be competing often with people who have bachelors in the fields with the same names, because often even a bachelor's degree in that particular program, like psychology or neuroscience, doesn't actually get you ready for grad school. So those students often do things like research assistantships or lab managerships. Those are two things to know. Keep those in mind: research assistantships and lab manager positions. They pay well, and they can pay well if you get a nice one, and you'll be able to be paid to find out if you like something. The reason I tried both physics and cognitive science was I did 3 internships while I was in school, meaning St. John's. And by the end, those were the 2 things I liked the most. And like Kat said, you're not going to find out whether you really want to do something every day until you do it every day. So that's the benefit of having a sort of infrastructure where you can either volunteer or try to get paid to try out working in that field. I did physics first because, and I mentioned that just because of this principle. When you want to try out different things, do the thing with the longest timeline or the most difficult timeline first. That way, if you end up falling in love with it, you're already in the timeline, and that's great, and you'll work through it nicely, and then you can sort of go down that way. That's just a bit of practical stuff. Hopefully I addressed that question.
Yeah, I wish I had met this guy earlier. He could have told me that I should have gone down that path. That would have been really helpful.
I'm just jealous of all the paid positions. I do a lot of free labor, y'all. It's part and parcel of the learning experience.
Just to apply it to law school a little bit, you probably won't get a paid position in law school. There are some might be able to get a paid internship. Depends on what you want to do. I was a paralegal right after St. John's, and that really helped clarify what kind of law I didn't want to do. But it was sort of something that was very beneficial to me when I started applying for law school. So I recommend, if you're thinking about law school and you want to get some work experience, going and finding a law firm that you believe in, or a place that you believe in, and being a paralegal. I wouldn't necessarily recommend doing what I did, what kind of paralegaling I did, but I could also talk about that with anyone if they have any questions about that.
I don't see any other questions. So I think we're going to wrap up. I want to thank the panelists again for spending so much time with us, and for the students and alumni who have attended. I think this was such a great, valuable session. So thank you so much. And please reach out to any of us, offices or alumni, with any further questions or any contact or anything you need. So thanks again, and have a good night.